Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah, here we are again.
This is number, can you believe it, 64.
Okay, that's great.
And today, I'm going to slate. Today is March 13th, 2018, and we have a fabulous guest today, as usual. Almost all our guests are fabulous because we only have very interesting guests on Shattered Reality. But this gentleman has written 9 books to date, I believe. He will correct me if I am wrong, I am sure. But I believe he has written 9 books, and we are going to be speaking about his second to last book. In other words, we will mention any and all of his books, but we will be primarily speaking about his second to last book called Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness. Now, our guest has been a professional writer for a number of years. He's also very well established in the business community, but he has had some very unusual experiences of his own in the area of consciousness that has caused him to delve deeply into that field. And I mean deeply. His books are very interesting, slightly complicated, and very thought-provoking. So now I would like to welcome our guest, Anthony Peake.
Welcome to the show, Anthony.
Wonderful to be with you guys. Really, looking forward to this interview.
Good.
So are we.
Indeed, we are. Basically, you spoke of consciousness and how at one point your mind changed about the nature of consciousness. Most of our listeners are used to hearing us speak to some extent about our idea about consciousness and the mind being like a radio receiver, and that consciousness is above other things. It's above the material universe in a certain sense, insofar as it proceeds. Consciousness is the primary factor in life, and it's the factor that we cannot explain so readily in terms of materialist reductionist paradigms. So if you could, if you don't mind, tell us when you reached that point where things changed for you, where you realized that perhaps the physical world was not all that.
Sure. No, absolutely. For most of my life, I've been what I would term a very precise materialist reductionist, in that by training, I'm a sociologist. I studied sociology at university, and I also studied at university the sociology of belief systems and such like. But ever since I was very, very young, I've been fascinated by extraordinary experiences that people have had. But my approach had always been that these extraordinary experiences are misinterpretations of how the brain works. So in other words, the idea that consciousness is, in a technical term, an epiphenomenon of brain processes. So in other words, consciousness evolved as part and parcel of the human brain as the human brain evolved, and that there's a direct one-to-one relationship between what consciousness is and brain processes.
Right.
And it was only when I started to look into in greater detail, when I started researching material for my first book, that I started to realize that it is far more complex than this. The whole materialist reductionist paradigm that consciousness really is just the brain I started to question it quite strongly, because to me there is something mysterious about the fact that consciousness is something completely non-physical. It doesn't have extension in space, it doesn't have extension in time, and yet somehow through our bodies, we interface within linear time and within everything else. So I started to question this a little bit more. And as I started to question the actual status of reality, the way in which the physical reality around us exists in terms of leading edge science, you start to realize that the physical universe we think is physical and solid isn't physical and solid at all. There is nothing there. And indeed, everything we perceive is presented to us by our senses, which then our brains process and create and manipulate in a certain way. So it means that effectively what there is a spiritual something that is using the body almost like, I don't know, like somebody who dives into the deep depths of the ocean. This body that we use, this meat machine that we use, is the way in which we can exist within this particular facet of reality, this simulation that we live within. And it came as quite a shock to me, because up until that stage, because I remember arguing for many, many years with my mother, particularly, who was quite a religious lady, was that, you know, that what you believe is nonsense. But as you get older, you start to realize that knowledge starts to be tempered by wisdom. And as you get older, wisdom starts to come in here, and you have life experiences that gives you a totally different worldview of exactly what is taking place. And to me, people who are very much grounded in the materialist reductionist worldview are not taking the evidence as life tells you. They're actually placing it within a framework that they believe is the correct framework of life. And unfortunately, that framework for the vast majority of people is stuck in the science of the late 1890s. They haven't progressed any further from there.
They haven't gotten up to being with the quantum physicists like Max Planck and so forth. I would say that some of the materialist reductionist people, particularly that the extremely skeptical people, they are terrified, because if they let go of the solid reality, what they perceive as the solid reality around them, I think that they would lose all moorings, all their moorings is the best way that I can put it. And they seem terrified to me. And their insistence upon simply the, as you say, the late 18th century model of physics is part and parcel of that, because once they realize that the table isn't really solid, and the fact that if a person such as you or I or Kate has an intention and is strong enough about it, one can even shift reality a little bit in very small doses.
No, I agree. And the issue really is that there is a wonderful word in English called hubris. And hubris is that self-congratulatory idea that we know everything. And I'm reminded of the fact in 1894, a guy called Michelson, who was the guy that was involved in the Michelson-Morley experiment, which disproved the existence of the ether, was opening an extension to the University of Chicago. And he made this grandiose statement where he turned around and he said, there's no point in contributing to science and physics anymore, because all we need at the moment is to fine-tune things to the 6th decimal point. Now, what is even more interesting about this particular analogy is a few years earlier, there was a young German guy who was about to go to university, and he couldn't make up his mind whether he wanted to be a musician or whether he wanted to be a physicist. And this young gentleman went to his physics tutor and said, what do I do about this? And the physics tutor said, rather similarly to Michelson, said, there's no future in physics. We understand everything there is to know about physics. So this young man still decided he would become a physicist, and that young man's name was Max Planck. Yeah. And Max Planck was then employed by the German government to make to effectively make light bulbs more effective. Light bulbs at that time, the Germans were very much behind the British and the Americans in terms of the development of light bulbs, and they needed a way of actually making light bulbs not explode with the heat. So, of course, he did a lot of research, and he discovered there was something curiously wrong about our understanding of the basic nature of energy. And in December of 1900, he stood up at the German Association of Physics in Berlin and made a statement that energy comes in tiny packets. It's not continual. It comes in tiny things called quanta. So effectively, the man that caused the quantum revolution, Max Planck himself, could have not ended up researching the things he did, because he himself could not understand the impact of the information he was receiving. You know, he completely threw. As he said, it was an act of desperation to make it understandable. There's something called black body radiation, which I won't go into technical detail about, but they really couldn't understand about black body radiation and how the maths worked in black body radiation. Of course, in 1905, Einstein comes along with his theory of relativity, and suddenly the whole world changes. And suddenly what they believed they understood about the true nature of reality was out of the window. Now, the big question we have now is even more profound, because in 1999, a young Australian philosopher stood up and said, physics has the soft problem, which is how the brain works and how it processes. But the hard problem of physics and the hard problem of science is how inanimate matter within the brain, in other words, electricity reacting with atoms, creates us, creates our hopes, our dreams, our fears, and everything else. And they're not even at first base in understanding that. So they have that problem. They also have the problem they never, ever talk about. And the problem is a simple one. There are two central forms of science at the moment. There is, on one side, we have quantum physics, which is about the very, very small. And at the other side, we have relativity, which deals with the very, very big. If you used the mathematical formulae that they use in quantum physics and plug them into relativity, you get ridiculous answers. You get infinity. So clearly, we have two elements of knowledge fields that don't make any sense when related to each other, which suggests that there's a deeper reality of understanding. And that deeper reality of understanding, to me, is consciousness. Because quantum physicists know, and if you ever want to worry a materialist reductionist scientist, just turn to him and turn around and say about the collapse of the wave function and how it is that the act of observation, the act of measurement, turns a probability wave into a point particle. They have no idea how that happens, and they do not understand how it takes place, but it takes place in laboratories time and time and time again. We need a new paradigm of science, and that has to include within it, as a central point, consciousness.
I agree.
Because consciousness is not part of the brain, it is something external to the brain, and it is something the brain processes. Once we get over that bridge, scientism will disappear, and the things that we know, for instance, you guys know out there, and people out there who are listening to this, many of you have had extraordinary experiences. You've had precognition experiences, you've had out-of-the-body experiences, remote viewing experiences, contact with people that have passed over. These things have been happening since records began. We cannot ignore them. It is bad science to ignore them, and science needs to wake up and smell the coffee.
I agree 1,000%. And I also agree that consciousness is fundamental. And furthermore, the experiment, the double slit experiments that you have mentioned and we have spoken about on Shattered Reality at other times, to me, that if we take that as an example, we can see how intention, that is the act of observing something that may occur in the future, we intend that we'll go to the doctor and we'll get a good bill of health, let us say, as opposed to thinking only fear about it. I think that we can shift reality a little bit by paying attention to the I'm looking for the word, the quanta, and therefore manipulating things a little bit, looking for the best outcome to our problems. But that is on a much smaller level. So, Anthony, you have written a number of books. We want to give you an opportunity to talk, perhaps speak to some of the books that you have written, particularly the one that we will not particularly be covering today about J.B. Priestley, who is the British author of plays. He's a playwright, I believe. Do you want to just mention a little bit about that book for those who may be familiar, and then we'll get back to opening the doors of perception?
Absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Priestley, because I know that he's not terribly well known in America. But J.B. Priestley was a writer born at the turn of the 19th century, fought in the First World War, and then after completing the First World War, then went up to Cambridge and did his degree in Cambridge. But he was always fascinated by the things we're talking about now, consciousness, how consciousness is within reality and everything else. And Priestley was an intriguing man, because when he was a teenager, he was reading about the concept of Vedanta. The Hindu idea that we exist within, that everything we exist within is a mind-generated illusion. Mm-hmm. And that the concept of Maya,
yes.
the illusion we live within. And he was very keen to write in his plays and his novels these themes. And what he did was he wrote a series of novels and some fascinating plays. And in each of his plays, he deals with the biggest mystery of human experience, the mystery of time. Exactly what is time? When we talk about time, what do we mean by time? And he wrote a series of plays that dealt with the problem of time, right from his very earliest plays. Dangerous Corner, for instance, is a fascinating play because the end is the beginning. So it's circular. Mm-hmm. So you have this kind of eternal recurrence, eternal return concept. But then he became interested in the writings of Jung, and he also became particularly interested in the writings of a German philosopher by the name of Peter Ouspensky, and also a fairly obscure Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer by the name of John William Dunn. And John William Dunn wrote a book in 1929 called An Experiment with Time. And in this book, it's quite intriguing. Dunn had a series of dreams way back in the early 1904, 1905, where he dreamt about events that subsequently he read about in newspapers. And he came to believe that our dreams consist of elements of things that have yet to happen, and our dreams change them. And put them into a kind of a dream sequence. And he wanted to get these ideas across, so he wrote this phenomenal play called Time and the Conways. And in Time and the Conways, we have 3 acts. The first act is a group of individuals in 1919 in a wealthy community in the north of England. And at the end of the first act, the central character, Kay Conway, falls asleep, and the curtain comes down, and the next act starts. And the next act is 1937, and you see Kay, and you see the fashions have changed and everything else. But of course, in a normal play, this is the kind of thing plays do. There's a time switch and everything else.
Sure.
But what is clever about Time and the Conways is, as the second act progresses, you realize there's something far more complex going on. You realize that Kay Conway herself is actually dreaming the future. And she reacts in certain circumstances to events that take place that people tell her. And then at the end of the second act and into the third act starts, and she's back at the end of the first act with the knowledge of the future that she'd been given in the second act. I won't ruin the play for you, but it is phenomenally clever.
It sounds wonderful. It sounds
Yeah.
wonderful. And I think that although most of our listeners, our regular listeners, probably aren't aware of Mr. Priestley, they certainly are aware of another person you wrote about, which is Philip K. Dick. He is an extremely popular figure in the consciousness world and people who listen to our program. So I think that some of the elements are probably similar in their work. Am I correct?
Oh, totally. I mean, it's one of the things that intrigues me as to the way in which J.B. Priestley is considered to be, even in the UK here, to be a very, very old-fashioned, slightly arch writer of 1930s period dramas, when in fact he was so far ahead of the curve, people don't even realize how far ahead he was. As was the game with Philip K. Dick. You know, in my book, The Man That Remembered the Future, I put forward a case that Philip K. Dick was accessing information from somewhere else, from the field, whether we want to call it the Akashic Record or whatever. But effectively, Dick himself writes on various occasions that he experienced his own plots in his own future. In other words, he would write a novel or a short story, and then many years later, he would find himself living that short story. And he would suddenly realize and think, my God, I've already written about this. I'm now living an experience that I wrote about years ago. And he came up with this wonderful concept that he called orthogonal time, which is very similar to the theories of J.W. Dunn that Priestley was influenced by. I believe all these writers, there's a kind of a groundswell, a zeitgeist, a Weltgeist of knowledge that people can access under certain states of consciousness. And I believe that both Priestley and Dick were accessing this kind of information. Now, Philip K. Dick would argue that orthogonal time, there is a time behind the time we perceive, which runs at right angles to this time, where it is a permanent present. Now, if anybody has seen the movie Interstellar, you will remember in Interstellar, there's a sequence called a Tesseract sequence, where the central character is able to look back on the life of his daughter. And you see the daughter's life as would be seen by somebody observing time, our time, linear time, from outside time, within orthogonal time. So effectively, you see time as a permanent present. So in which case, precognition and distance viewing, remote viewing out of the body experiences suddenly become more sensible, because we are trapped within linear time, within this particular world, within this particular simulation we live within. But outside of the simulation, there's a different form of time. Now, there's something called the specious present, which psychologists talk about. And it's the idea of what is now, what is the moment of now. But for different creatures, the period of what is now is broader. And Philip K. Dick argued this in his movie, in his novel Minority Report, his short story Minority Report, which was made into a movie with Tom Cruise.
Indeed.
You will recall there are characters there called precogs.
Yes.
And what precogs do is their specious present is wider, it's longer. They can perceive their now is not a split second, but it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But there's absolutely no reason as to why we cannot perceive things outside of time, which would explain so many things that psychologists are discovering about perception. You know, I can go into detail later about this, because in my books, the most important thing you have to realize about my books is I start from science. I start from science, and then I take the science and apply the science to the experiences people have, rather than a lot of writers in the New Age world who actually take the experiences and then try to back explain them using the science. I do the opposite.
Yes, you very much do, and I'm very appreciative of that, though I also think that cataloging experiences can be useful. I mean, it's almost like a different kind of anthropology. We've had...
Well, just if I could
Okay,
just
sure.
interject
Sorry.
here just for 1 second, and then I'll let you two go. But But obviously, there has been some very useful advances, especially in medicine, using the so-called scientific method, which is collecting data, which you want to do as far as collecting events. There's a definite method. I mean, if you're a biochemist and you want to develop a new antibiotic, there's certain steps you take, and then hopefully you acquire that knowledge. What I don't see to me, it seems you say there's energy, there's matter, and then there's a super consciousness. I don't see what steps you're taking to investigate that particular field, or if there's any steps to be taken.
The issue, the major problem is that modern science in its present form deals with physical objects.
Right.
And which
then
have
how do you deal
extensions.
with non-physical objects?
Exactly.
What data are you collecting?
Exactly. That's the challenge. The challenge is the only way we can scientifically quantify such things is by asking the experiencer what they experience. And then you have the problem of the way in which the brain functions and the way in which the brain embroiders reality.
But
to me,
but you're collapsing waves again. In other words, the person that experiences these events has collapsed it into that person's reality. So it's going to be very difficult. And I think that's a problem in the field.
Totally.
Gaining footage.
I'm totally with you on this. I think our major...
It's too bad. Because, it would be a great field to get into, but it's going to be, you're right, it is a challenge.
Well, one of the things, I work with scientists regularly, and it's one of the issues that one of the major criticisms that people have of my work, materialist reductionists have of my work, are saying, where's your experimental proof? But the thing is, we are dealing with ephemeral experiences. Mm-hmm. You can't quantify, like if somebody has a precognitive deja vu sensation, you can't reproduce that in laboratory conditions in the way in which science would demand it. You can't do it.
Well, right, exactly. You cannot use scientific methods to investigate what you're investigating. So you would have to develop a whole new field.
But if there are results that are true, if someone has an out-of-body experience and they're laying on a bed that's verifiable in the hospital in London, and in their out-of-body, they go to Cardiff and they see their mother jumping.
But the thing of it is for that person it's true, but what Anthony is trying to develop is something that's true for everybody. And that's understandable for everybody, and that's where the difficulty comes in.
And you're hitting the nail on the head here. This is the issue, that somebody will have an out-of-the-body experience and will bring back information that they couldn't ordinarily know about. But the problem is there are other ways that I believe that they are out of their body and they do perceive things. But taking the point of view of an ardent materialist reductionist, they would say, but there are other ways that information could be acquired. What we need is the smoking gun. But even if we end up with a smoking gun, they will then fall back on the argument, say it's coincidence. And they do that time and time again. I have so many cases of precognitive experiences, out-of-the-body experiences. For instance, there's an associate of mine called Graham Nichols. Now, when I wrote my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, a few years ago, Graham approached me because I was very much in that book taking a fairly grounded materialist reductionist argument to say that all out-of-body experiences are internal experiences. They're allied with hypnagogia, they're allied with dream sequences. And Graham said, you're wrong. Because he said he knew from his own experience that he had an out-of-the-body experience, that he acquired information that he couldn't have possibly done so. And what happened with Graham, it still stuns me, and I cannot explain this. And I've challenged top scientists on this, and they cannot explain it. And he has witnesses to this. Graham was lecturing on an out-of-the-body experience course, and suddenly he felt his legs go, and he collapsed, and he went into an altered state of consciousness. While he was in the altered state of consciousness, he found himself in a jungle, and he could feel the heat, and he found himself walking through plants and trees and everything else. And he parted the trees to step out of the trees to find himself standing on the corner of Wardour Street and another street in central London, in Soho. He was back in London, and he said, it was so real, I felt somebody run past me. A young lad ran past him, and he felt the displacement of the air. He then looked down the street, and as he did so, he saw an explosion take place in a public house halfway down the street. He then saw people staggering out covered in blood. He then hears voices, and the voices are going, Graham, Graham, are you okay? And these were the people in the lecture theatre. And he feels himself rising out of this dream sequence, and he's coming to in the lecture theatre. The first thing he says is to 6 witnesses, and he says, there is going to be a terrorist attack in Soho, in Old Compton Street, soon, and there's going to be people killed. 5 days later, a bomb destroys a pub called the Admiral Duncan, a gay pub in central London, and a nail bomb went off in exactly, and I mean exactly, the location that Graham described to these witnesses. He has signed affidavits from 5 people. Even so, the critics, when I cite this, will turn around and say it's coincidence. And you can never argue with that. You can never get round that. They will say it's coincidence. However powerful a precognition is, they can always draw on coincidence.
What would be the purpose of the jungle in that? I mean, did he have any idea? Just curiously, I just...
As to why he was given this information?
No, as to why he initially thought he was in a jungle and then came out.
I don't know. He and I have discussed it. Yeah, he and I have discussed this a lot. I mean, we've done events together, and he and I have interviewed. I mean, there is on YouTube, if you put in Anthony Peake and Graham Nichols, you'll actually see me interviewing him at the point in London that he had this vision take place or whatever. It's very, very intriguing. He says that he knows when his out-of-body experiences are precognitive because he calls it the Cyrillian effect. He says that there's a kind of a tinge of blue in the air. And we're working on this, Graham and I. We're working with other scientists because we're trying to find ways of working with this. Now, I'm also working with 2 Austrian guys, Dr. Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Dirk Prokol. Engelbert Winkler is a consultant psychologist and Winkler is a consultant neurologist. They have invented a machine called the lucid light device, the hypnagogic light device. I believe that this device actually stimulates the pineal gland to synthesize dimethyltryptamine within the brain. And it then brings about altered states of consciousness. So I believe we're in the circumstance where we can actually probably engineer altered states of consciousness in somebody and then try and do brain scans as to find out what's going on in the brain at that point in time. So here we are starting to try and get tangible evidence.
I actually think a lot of that went on in the 60s too. You know, that
I'm sorry.
I think a lot of that went on in the 60s as well. What is your endpoint to this? I mean, what would be the purpose of studying this? Is there a purpose, or is it just pure knowledge? I mean, just out of curiosity.
The greatest mystery for me, and has always been, I am something experiencing something.
Okay.
I will experience something for a finite amount of time. I will have not existed for billions of years, and according to the modern paradigm of science, I will cease to exist for billions of years. I find that to be totally ridiculous, but that is what the evidence tells us. So for me, my life, and my life for the last 20 years, has been singularly and focusedly to understand exactly what consciousness is when people have out-of-the-body experience, is exactly what is taking place. And we, in order to facilitate the next paradigm of science, we have to move away from the materialist reductionist model, which I totally agree has been wonderful. We would not be talking now without the advances made by the materialist reductionist model. Newtonian physics and quantum physics are the things that make things happen. But clearly, we need to understand, and it is the human, we are here to understand exactly what we are. And I believe we are at the time now that we are in a position because of the way in which our culture is developing, that we have the worldview to understand things in greater detail. For example, we have virtual reality now. We have Oculus Rifts. We have ways and means that we can simulate realities that are three-dimensional, that feel totally real. We are now in the position that we can think about the idea that the reality we perceive is brain created. You know, what Henri Bergson argued and what many of the philosophers have argued, that the reality we perceive is as much an hallucination as dreams are. It is just that they are consensual because we seemingly share them with other people. So my aim and my drive, you know, and I'm now in my mid-60s, so I know I only have probably 10 years of my brain being able to function enough to be able to do the things I'm doing, to try and push humanity forward. Because this is the great mystery. When we die, where do we go? Do we just die? Do we just disappear? Are we just links in a genetic chain? Is it that we are misunderstanding the brain? As you know, in one of my books, I argue that we are so neuronal in the sense of we believe the brain works through the neurons. I argue the brain works through the glial cells. And there is a totally different communication. The glial cells communicate non-locally. We are now developing some very, very interesting ideas. And it's where humanity will go forward. It's almost post-humanism in that term.
Is this going to all be in your book that you're writing now, I assume, the companion book, the Opening the Doors #2, so to speak?
Yeah, the new book is my attempt. It was my publisher actually requested I wrote this book, unusually, because normally I go to my publisher and say, this is what I'd like to write. But this one I'm taking in Opening the Doors of Perception. As you know, I discuss the subjective experiences of hallucinations and various other things that people experience. But when they experience these things, they encounter entities and beings that seem to have their own motivations. Mm-hmm. When somebody has a lucid dream, you know, I cite Robert Wagner, the lucid dream writer.
Yes.
When he has experienced in lucid dreams entities that seem to have their own motivations. The new book is saying, well, let's go through the doors of perception and look at the viewpoint from outside the doors of perception. What is going on there? Is there a greater reality that the reducing engine, which is the brain, denies us? Now, again, Henri Bergson argued that the brain is a reducing engine. It takes out information in order for us to be able to survive within this simulation. Now, there is a lot of research now being done about the idea of the holographic nature of reality, that reality works on holographic principles, and it works on informational principles. In other words, everything we perceive is actually based on information. Mm-hmm. And reality is created by a conscious mind reacting with the information field. Now, again, this is to do, and it's fascinating, this is directly to do with black holes. And it's directly to do with the research of Stephen Hawking and his discovery of something called Hawking radiation. Mm-hmm. It's very, very intriguing stuff. There is a group of Israeli researchers at the moment. Jacob Bekenstein is one of the guys in question. And again, if anybody's out there listening to this, don't take my words for this. There was 4 or 5 years ago an edition of Scientific American written, and the article was written by Jacob Bekenstein. And he's discussing exactly how it is that you can prove, using the theories of black holes and everything else, that this is a hologram. We are inside a massive hologram. The question is the hologram created? Are we living in a simulation? And again, there is arguments from people like Nick Bostrom, and there's various philosophers that are very much taking, and there's a guy called Vlatko Vedrel, who's one of the world's top leading quantum physicists at the moment, very young guy. He's very much coming to the conclusion. Elon Musk, you're a famous American guy, mm-hmm. recently made this statement that it's a simulation, that we are existing in a simulation. So I think what is happening is the collective consciousness of humanity is starting to now build together to break out of the simulation, to realize that there is a greater something out there that we're trapped within. Do you remember the old adage of Plato's cave? You know, the idea that, do you know of Plato's cave?
Yes. With the shadows, yeah.
The shadow. people.
The shadows. Now, just to explain for the listeners, Plato's cave, put forward by Plato the philosopher, said, imagine a scenario that there are a group of individuals that have all their lives, they've been chained in a side of a cave, looking at the back wall of a cave. Behind them is a fire. And in front of the fire is a bridge. And people walk across the bridge and the shadows are cast in front of the people that are trapped. They believe that all the reality they perceive are the shadows on the cave wall. One of the young men manages to break his chains, and he goes and he realizes that the world he exists in is an illusion. He then goes to the cave entrance and sees the real world as it is. Then he goes back and tells his friends, and they don't believe him. Mm-hmm. And they don't believe him because their whole worldview is based upon what their senses tell them. This is what happens with people who have extraordinary experiences. These are people who, I argue, go through the doors of perception. People who have Alzheimer's, people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who have migraine, people who have schizophrenia, various other altered states, people who take dimethyltryptamine, LSD. They break through the walls of perception and see reality as it really is. And they see the holographic nature of the reality. And I think this is the moving forward. But the billion-dollar question is, if this is a simulation, has this simulation been created? And if it's been created, do the creators of the simulation want us to be able to understand the fact that we're in a simulation? Because if the people in the simulation realize it's a simulation, it changes everything.
It would certainly seem to me, from my personal experience, as little as personal experience holds weight, that there are others, and there are more than one others. So in the unseen world, in the world of beings that may not be in the physical, discarnate entities, if you will, maybe never have been incarnated, and but there's not just one thing out there. That has been my direct perception. I also wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the International Remote Viewers Association, and one of their members, who was a former government remote viewing tasker by the name of Dale Graff. Dale Graff has been working with dreams and has a method by which you can fairly reliably get information about the future by focusing your dreaming attempts, let's say, on page 3 of the New York Times 5 days hence. And I have tried his method in a not a very scientific way, kind of just trying to do it by myself, and I've gotten some very, very positive and interesting results. And so that might be some place, if you're not familiar with that, for you to look at the dream state. I would love for you to get into some of the words that you use in your book that may not be familiar to most people, like the daimonic, Plurona, idotonic, those kind of words, which, having read your books, I am familiar with, but most people are not.
Okay. The concept of the daemon and eidolon is the terms daemon and eidolon are actually from ancient Greek, and they were very much terms used by the Gnostics, which were a schismatic Christian sect just after the birth of Christ, and have carried on through in sort of various esoteric groups around the world. And the idea is that we are not singular beings, we are dual beings, and that we have an everyday consciousness that exists within linear time, which in my book I've adapted this, and I call this the eidolon. Now, for me, the eidolon is, if anybody plays a third-person computer game, you will know that you have an avatar on the screen, and the avatar you guide through its existence in the game. So, for instance, you play, Tomb Raider, and Lara Croft appears on the screen. And every time you start the game, Lara is born, and she goes down a corridor, and she walks into a room and a monster comes out and she kills her. Lara is killed. But the person playing the game isn't killed, and they have the memory that Lara was killed next time. So Lara is reborn again, and this time the game player is aware of the dangers in the room. So the game player tries to make sure Lara doesn't go in the room, and she goes down another room and gets killed again and goes back. Now, Lara, for me, is what I call the eidolon. We are all eidolons. We are all within the game of life. But there is an element of us that is from the Plurona. Now, again, the Plurona is something that's used in Gnosticism. It is the place outside of this existence, the mind-forged manacles, as Blake called them, or Philip K. Dick had a term he called it as well, the black iron prison. This reality we live within. So we are within the game, and we are unaware of the fact that we have lived this life many, many times. We believe that this is the first time we've lived this life and that we don't know the future. But there is the element of us called the Daimon, which is our game player. And the Daimon has lived this life before, probably multiple of times. The Daimon is that voice in your head that warns you not to do things. It is the thing that creates inklings in you that something feels not right. It is that voice in your head when you meet that person that is special, that you just know this person is going to be incredibly influential in your life. It's the Daimon. The Daimon warns you in dreams. It gives you precognitive dreams. The Daimon effectively is your game player, and it is trying to guide you through your life. But eventually, you will get to a point in your game where the Daimon can't protect you anymore. And you get to a point where the last time you lived your life, you didn't get any further. And the Daimon can't protect you, and you get killed again, and you go back and you start again. Now, the world we live within, this world of living it over and over again and changing it because the Daimon changes it, I call the Bohemian IMAX. I call it the Bohemian IMAX for two reasons. The first reason is it's in reflection of the great American quantum physicist David Bohm, who came up with an idea called the implicate order. Mm-hmm. And the idea David Bohm argued is that there's a deeper level of reality that we don't perceive accurately. This explains things like non-locality in quantum physics, which we don't have time to deal with now. But effectively, it explains a lot of the effects that we know that are mysteries in quantum physics. So, and I call it the Bohmian IMAX because I'm smacking at one of the top reductionist materialists. In fact, he's an unlimited materialist called Daniel Dennett.
Oh, yes.
And Daniel Dennett wrote a book a few years ago called Consciousness Explained. Talk about hubris. Consciousness Explained. What arrogance. But effectively, he argues that there is no inner life. We are fooling ourselves into even thinking we are consciously aware. Now, every single living human being knows that is complete nonsense. But this is the revised wisdom, supposedly, of our supposed intellectual betters, that we are not even conscious, but we fool ourselves. The mystery to me is, I'd love to know who Daniel Dennett thinks he's being fooled, because I can't fool a stone into believing anything. In other words, you have to be self-reflective in order to be fooled by anything. But that's inside the point. But Daniel Dennett has this concept he calls the Cartesian theatre in his book, Consciousness Explained. And the Cartesian theatre is how the world we live in and the world we create, that we live within. Now, I argue that we don't live within a Cartesian theatre. We live within a Bohmian IMAX, which is much, much wider. So I argue that you live your life over and over again, as Connors does in the movie Groundhog Day. Mm-hmm. And every time you live your life, you get it better. Your Daimon helps to guide you to just get it slightly better. It's like evolution. You evolve yourself, so you're being reincarnated, but as yourself in your own life, to fine-tune your life to live the perfect life, as Connors does at the end of Groundhog Day, when suddenly he's allowed to move on to the next day. I believe when you live the perfect life, your Daimon has succeeded, you've lived the perfect game, and then you move on. But the interesting thing is, in my book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of When We Die, which is my first book, I argue that this all happens in the final seconds of your life. And the reason I argue this, and I call this concept cheating the ferryman, because I argue you never die. You die in the worlds of other people, but because your time scale changes at the point of death, because as we know in near-death experiences, people, what are the moody traits in near-death experiences? They turn around and they say, time slows down. You have a flashback of your life. You meet the being of light. There are three of the traits. I can explain all of those. The first one, your life flashes before your eyes. That's in a near-death experience. In a real-death experience, your life doesn't flash in front of your eyes. It's a literal minute-by-minute recreation of your life. The near-death experience analogy that takes place is because the system's gone wrong. You're not actually going to die, so they have to literally fast-forward it. The second point, that time slows down. We all know that in times of stress, time slows down. I do the neurology of this. It's the release of glutamate in the brain. The glutamate flood that takes place in times of stress slows down your perception of time. We've all had this. You get bad news. You're in a car crash. You fall. Time slows down. That's the glutamate kicking in, because time is subjective. So in which case, in your subjective world, in your last second of life, could last 70 years. In that 70 years, you live your life again, but you live within the simulated life, like a simulation, like a computer game. And this is where the Daimon then comes in, which is the being of light that people talk about. The being of light fascinates me. The being of light, if you actually read the NDE reports, and I'm a professional member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and in fact, the first paper that presented cheating the ferryman was actually an academic paper published in their journal, their academic journal, back in 2001, I think it was, 2000 maybe. The idea is that the near-death experience is incredibly common, but we are misinterpreting what is taking place there. Now, the ancient Greeks had this concept of drinking the water of the Lethe. I don't know if you know, but the old legend is, isn't it, that you die and you're a shade and you find yourself on the edges of the Acheron River and the Styx, and out of the mists comes Charon, the boatman, and he takes you over and you pay him a little obolos, a little coin, which is placed underneath your tongue when you die or when you're dead. You pay him and he takes you across the Acheron to Hades. And when you get to Hades, you're given the choice of either going forward into heavenly bliss or drinking the waters of the Lethe, the river of forgetting. In the legend, you drink the Lethe and it wipes out all your previous life memories. Then you're allowed to go back across the Acheron, back into your life again to live your life again. This is why I call my book, the concept, Cheating the Ferryman. You never pay the ferryman his coin because you never in time get to that point. Because at the end of your second life, the same thing happens again and again and again. And it's, of course, Zeno's bisection paradox. The idea is you can bisect time into smaller and smaller compartments because, of course, time is subjective. So that's what I mean by this. Now, the other place that we move into that our daemon exists in, this timeless location, is what I call a Plurona. I call it the Plurona because I've adopted that term, but the Plurona is the term that the ancient Gnostics used, because I believe that the ancient Gnostics had a huge amount of wisdom. And I even suggest that the Holy Grail that the Cathars, the Cathari, and various other Gnostic groups throughout the centuries have protected is not literally the sangreal. It's not literally the chalice that held Jesus's blood. What it is this secret that we live our life over and over again. Nietzsche talked about it. Very famous writers have talked about it time and time again. Even people like James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, Finn again, awake. It's the whole idea. This is the secret of the ages, as far as I'm concerned. We are immortal beings, and we come back again and again and again. In my final point, if anybody's interested in this, Peter Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher, wrote an amazing novel in the 1930s called The Life of Ivan Osokin. In this, he discusses exactly that, And then finishing off with J.B. Priestley. J.B. Priestley believed these ideas, and he wrote a play called I Have Been Here Before in 1938. And in this play, you have a character who knows he's living his life again, who goes back into his life to stop two people he has lived the life before making a huge mistake and running off with each other.
Well, you've done a masterful job here of explaining some of your concepts to us, and our hour is about done. So what I would like you to do is do yourself a little commercial here. Talk about your own online interviews and your various books and projects, and you're doing some kind of something in Australia upcoming, or am I mistaken about that?
No, I am. It was only the last few days we've been negotiating terms for it, but I will be speaking about these concepts in front of Ayers Rock, Uluru. In the centre of Australia as the sun sets. So the idea is I'm the keynote speaker for an event that will be taking place the middle of January next year. I was invited down and I spoke in Melbourne 3 years ago with PMH Atwater, who you may know.
Yes, she's been our guest.
Lady. Oh, good. Yeah, PMH. I was in contact with PMH only a few days ago, actually. And she and I did an event in Melbourne 2 years ago. And I've been invited back to do this special event over there. So I'll be doing that.
Sounds magical.
It's going to be wonderful. I am so looking forward to it. I have a lot of fans down in Australia. And, it's a magical location, Ayers Rock or Uluru is one of the special places. But if anybody's interested in my work, my website is anthonypeake.com. That's Peake with an E on the end. I'm also extremely active on Facebook. I have a Facebook site. If you look up Anthony Peake, you'll find me. At the moment, I'm topped out at 5,000 because they top you out at 5,000 friends. But you can still follow me if you wish. And then if you seek out friendship, I will then try and find a space as people drop out. Also on YouTube, if you just put in Anthony Peake on YouTube, you will get lots of my lectures. In fact, one of my lectures that was put up was recorded about 4 years ago, was recent in October, was posted on YouTube, a remake of it, and it's now had 250,000 viewings in 4 months.
Wow.
And it's having about 1,000 a day at the moment. So just look that up. It's Anthony Peake on YouTube. You will find it because it's the biggest one I've done. But there's lots of material on there. To me, these are not my ideas. These are ideas that people have had for years. I'm very keen to involve people in my work. If you're interested in please contact me. I get scores of emails a day, but I try to respond to all of them if I can. I want people's experiences. I need evidence. I need proof. I need the smoking gun. I need the white crow or the black swan that will actually prove that these things are true. So please help me if you can. If you don't agree with what I say, that's great. Contact me and we can debate it. Because remember, I'm not channeling this from Planet Tharg. I'm not doing anything else. I'm just a searcher after truth. And if the things I say are technically incorrect, tell me. I don't mind. I'll revise them. It's important to me that my science is correct. Because if it is not correct, I cannot take this to the scientists.
Well, we would love to speak with you again sometime and maybe get further into the spectrum of experiences that you speak about in Opening the Doors of Perception, which involve autism and schizophrenia and Alzheimer's and classic migraine and the dreams. And I do really, I can speak for that one particular type of dream studies that Dale Graff has done with the International Remote Viewing Association. So, Anthony Peake, thank you so much for your time.
Can I just make one final point?
Sure.
I'm very intrigued by the image that you have on your Skype site, which, unless I'm mistaken, is a sculpture from the north of Athens.
Yeah, that's
of
right.
a running man.
Was it?
It used to be in front of the Athens Hilton.
Really?
Yeah, it's they've now moved it. It's outside the university. I went past it about 2 months ago.
Oh.
It's a fascinating piece of sculpture, isn't it?
Yeah.
How embarrassing.
Why did you
I never
choose?
knew that.
Why did you choose that?
I didn't.
You'll have to speak to Bill about that.
Yeah,
I just thought it looked cool.
it does. It's amazing.
See
That's
that?
absolutely amazing.
Okay, well, Bill, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Bill is
no.
our trusty
Oh, no.
engineer who makes all of this possible.
And he's so modest.
And he is. He's shy and modest, and we love him very much. So with that, Anthony Peake, thank you so much for your participation, and we hope you'll be a guest again.
Yeah, and good luck in your research. Really, you're a brave guy to go out there where no one has gone before. I mean, obviously people have tried before, but good luck out there.
And give Daniel Dennett hell for me too.
I will.
Thank you.
Maybe that symbol of that actual figure is me running forward into the future with the blast of the past pulling me back. But thanks, guys. Thank you so much as well for inviting me, because it's very important. And it is very nice of you to invite me and give me the opportunity to speak to your
really
audience.
our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure again, and so long for now. Well,
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're very welcome.
Well, that was wonderful, Kate.
Yeah.
I find Anthony Peake to be a great distiller of knowledge from various places, and he really does his homework. He really does all the reading, and he distills these ideas down. He doesn't make them simple, but he collects all these things
I
together.
don't think he's studying something that's simple.
No, it's quite clearly not simple concepts, and I highly recommend his books. I've read several of them. As I said, I believe there are 9 available now.
You know what I think that one of the problems is when you study something like consciousness, people assume that it's like you should know this instinctively, like you don't have to learn it, you don't have to study it, you should be able to dream a dream, predict the future, whatever. And they never realize, like, if you're going to be a quantum physicist, let's say you really are interested in that and you want to develop it, well, you go through first of all, you go through high school, then you go through 4 years of college, then you go through 2, 3, 4, 5 years of additional studies, and then you work in the field, and finally you begin to understand it. But you don't understand it instinctively, you build on the work of others. And
Absolutely.
It's the same with consciousness. People think like, oh, yeah, like let's say, all right, so Fahrusha, you're a psychic. Well, you don't have to study to be a psychic. You either are or you're not. You're a great artist or you're not a great artist. But that's not true. I mean, look at Bill. I mean, he was not born being a phenomenal musician. He had to study it. You were not born being a psychic. You had to go through all these life experiences to develop it. And that's where he runs into trouble when he starts to fight the so-called scientific community, because they don't see him putting in the work and the progressive steps that they've taken to get where they are. And they think, oh, this guy's just making it up out of thin air, And in actuality, he has not been. I mean, he's really been working very hard on
Yes,
it.
yes. And very bright man as well, quite clearly, a very bright man.
If you weren't, you wouldn't be interested in this. I mean, you'd be dull and you'd accept the, the red pill, the blue pill. I mean, he was talking Matrix there for a long time.
Yes.
And, it's a fascinating field, but as I said to him, good luck. I mean, the methods are not there. They're not there.
Well, you are the one with the scientific method in mind in the group of the two of us, so we'll have to, I can't disagree with you there.
Not the scientific method, but a method.
A method.
Humans have to, I think it's a downside of the human brain that you have to go step A, step B, step C. Maybe what he was talking about is suddenly you be in step X. If you're going to do that for the general population, you have to understand the steps that were taken to get there. And that's the method that's not being
Well, as our previous
discovered.
guest, Dr. Julie Beischel, had mentioned, it's one of her signature sayings is that you catalog experiences, and it's not just one-off experiences, but after a while you have a set of data, no?
No, it's not going to work because you're using the scientific method to discover and understand something that is basically not scientific in the sense of Newtonian quantum, whatever. Like he said that there's force and there's matter, and then this consciousness is outside of both. So you cannot use methods to uncover the science, so-called, between force and matter, to uncover what's the force behind consciousness. It's a whole separate thing, and that method has not yet been discovered. And I give him credit for trying to. He's doing a good job, but good luck. No Nobel Prizes there yet.
Not yet. But I think they're coming.
It's going to be a humdinger when it comes, I'll tell you.
Yes, indeed. Wait.
I think Bill's rushing.
I think so, but I do want to mention, by the way, that we do have Laird Scranton on, and he is very interested in linguistics and prehistoric times, and really fascinating concepts of drawing different parts of early civilizations together. I cannot tell you how interesting his books on this are. They're extremely interesting, and we're going to welcome him in a couple of weeks to Shattered Reality
But
Podcast.
that's just exactly what Anthony was saying. It's linguistics and the social contract, whether it's religions or whatever, that sort of underlie the reality for whatever group they're in, and that's why he's referring to it as a hologram. So he's actually a good guest to follow up with this guy.
Yeah, I think so. In the meantime, everybody should remember that we are non-commercial. No one tells us what to say or what to do.
Or pay us for that.
We get paid nothing at all. So when we have people on this show, you know that these are people that we're really interested in. There is no hidden agenda here, except that we find the concepts extraordinarily interesting and we want to introduce them to you. So you, dear listener, if you would like to be in touch with us, please contact us via Facebook. We have a Facebook page, which is Shattered Reality Podcast. We have a YouTube channel, Shattered Reality Podcast. We have 2 different websites, and we are on iTunes, and I think we're on Stitcher as well. But we are readily available, shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com, shatteredrealitypodcast.com. Those are our two websites. So please contact us, particularly if you have an interesting experience and you would like to be in our listener's corner. What do you say, Kate?
Oh, yeah, come on, let's hear from you. You know, you have to actually contribute, I think.
Yeah, well,
to understand it. Right. So call us up, or what? Wait, you can't call us. Okay, sorry. Well, email us, whatever.
Or send a message through any one of our outlets.
Or if you really believe, you could just sort of contact us through the super consciousness.
Well, yeah, you could try that. Intention does work. Intention does work.
Even now, I'm getting a message.
What? It's time to go. Okay, so now, from Shattered Reality. Adios, amigos.